It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Alison Wolf for our next keynote speech. Alison Wolf, CBE, is a British economist and the Sir Roy Griffiths Professor of Public Sector Management at King's College, and in this field of vocational education has been working in this field a long time, but is especially noted for the Wolf Report that came out 3 years ago, which has been the single most influential report in vocational education that certainly that I'm aware of, and I believe that most of the recommendations have indeed been implemented, which is terrific. So clearly, Alison, your work is already making a huge difference. Alison's going to say a few words, and then we'll open it up for questions for people. So, Alison, over to you.
Thank you very much. Really great pleasure to be here. And obviously, I can't rival the leader of the opposition and the minister who is actually in charge of making policy. But I thought what I would try to do is to say a little bit about the labour market context in which policy is made. It was the labour market context that affected very much what I suggested in my review. And it's actually, to be honest, the labour market context which is going to determine how far either side actually manages to do the things that they would like to achieve. Because the realities out there do always have a habit of coming up and hitting both politicians and academics on the head, so that our best laid plans have a dreadful tendency to go away. So what I'm going to mostly do is say a little bit about today's world and explain how it underpinned what I suggested, and which happily has been implemented in the review that I did for the current coalition government, and then actually finish by saying something which I really want to say first, middle and last, which is that the single most important thing going on, I think, in vocational education today, and indeed in education today in this country, is the apprenticeship reform programme. And it is so important that it is not constantly changed as it goes along, that it has a chance to bed down. And I really, really hope that that is something that all sides recognise. So today's world, essentially, it's a world which has become a world of education, as Rod knows. I mean, your company is a major player in a way that no education company could have been a major player even 50 years ago. Full-time education to 18 is the norm, and at the same time, there have been major changes in the structure of the labour market over the last few years. And one of the things that has happened as a result is the disappearance of the old-style youth labour market. And I think that that's something which, in a sense, I personally only became aware of after it had happened. It happened later here than in most countries, right through the 1990s, when it was already virtually impossible if you were a 16-year-old in France or Italy or let alone Germany to go and get a job. You could actually leave school in the UK and actually get a job. And increasingly, that is not the case. And one of the things that has happened as a result, and I do want to underline that it's, in my view, as a result of the disappearance of these youth jobs, is that we've had an enormous increase in the number of people participating in full-time education post-16. Now, we've had the raising of the participation age, about which I have mixed feelings, as I suspect many people do, but it's here, it's come, it's done. It actually has made terribly little real difference, except at the margins, because actually the huge increases in participation predated this, and they reflect two things. They reflect, first of all, the disappearance of jobs for 16 and 17-year-olds, but the nature of participation for the 16 to 18 group also reflects the apprenticeship context in this country. And I just want to sort of illustrate the change quickly by just sort of showing you what has happened to full-time equivalent numbers of 16 to 18-year-olds in just in the last less than 20 years, in the last 15 years. And the numbers at a time when that there was no huge explosion in population. This is overwhelmingly because of increases in the staying on rate. You've got this big increase in the number staying on in schools and this huge increase in the number staying on in FE colleges, which has, among other things, completely transformed the nature of the college sector so that it has become overwhelmingly about educating the young rather than educating adults. And the thing that's happened alongside that is this shrinkage in part-time education. And this, I think, is really important because part-time education is essentially what apprentices used to do. The old tradition, I mean, when I was growing up in quite a small town in southern England, my father was was a governor of our local technical college, and at that point, you know, this went on right through until about the beginning of the 1980s. The overwhelming pattern for people leaving school, if they didn't do A-level, they left school and they went into an apprenticeship, especially the boys. It was, and then they did full part-time education at the college, often sponsored and indeed paid for by their employers. And what has happened is that part-time education among the young, that green bit, has shrunk in absolute terms and shrunk mammothly as a proportion of what's going on. So this means that what you've mostly got among 16 to 18-year-olds is people who are in some form of full-time education. Apprenticeship has shrunk for this group, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So they are mostly in full-time education, whether they want to be or not. And this is actually quite bad news for those who would really rather not be, partly because the best predictor of being in employment is being in employment. You want to predict accurately who will have a job next year, just find people who've got a job this year. And you will just, you know, that will just swamp every other thing by far. And it's also true, least in apprenticeship countries, high apprenticeship countries, though even there it's true once you hit sort of 21, it's always true that the young are disproportionately unemployed. And they're always the ones who are disproportionately badly hit by recessions. So getting your first job is absolutely crucial, and this is, of course, one of the things that apprenticeship does. It brings you into the labour market. But it's particularly problematic for British young today. The youth labour market, which went on long after our apprenticeship system shrunk, has dried up. And most of them are in full-time education because there's nothing else to do, bluntly. Some of them are in full-time education because they passionately want to be there. A lot of them are there because actually that's what's on offer. And it's the only way they can see of getting into decent jobs later. And what's even worse is that we've even shrunk the Saturday job. It's a huge difference between my generation, people even in their mid to late 30s, and teenagers today, that the Saturday job, for a variety of reasons, has gone. And alongside that, you've also got the arrival of the hourglass economy, because in the period after the Second World War, and again, I'm conscious that most of you will know this already, there was this gigantic shift towards a growth in managerial and professional jobs, just absolutely gigantic. It transformed families, labour markets, society. That has slowed down. It's still increasing, but much more slowly. At the same time, we've got massive increases in productivity. You know, manufacturing is on its way to being the new agriculture. So it's highly skilled, but the number of jobs is shrinking. And at the same time, we've got, again, as everybody knows, this big increase in low-paid service jobs, which require soft rather than technical skills. Now, this is not something which is disproportionately affecting the young. I mean, it's in many ways even worse news for those people who become unemployed in their 40s. But it's the background to what one is doing for 16 to 18, 16 to 24-year-olds. It's pointless to believe that you can put that you know, basically everybody can have a manufacturing apprenticeship if we could only get ourselves together. And just to show you this, this shows you manufacturing as a share of GDP in this country, Germany, and France. The interesting thing is that although the top line, which is Germany, shows that they still have a larger share of GDP than we do, and France had and has a lower share of GDP than we do, what it also shows is that over the last couple of decades, they've all been shrinking at pretty much the same rate. So that's the problem, and the jobs that are actually growing are things like in numbers, not proportion. Always mistrust things which say the fastest growing job is X. If you grow from 1 to 10, my goodness, your growth rate will be fantastic. The growth, the absolute growth, is in things like care assistants, shop marketing manager is basically somebody who is slightly in charge of something like, you know, an accessorized branch. This is not somebody who's running Marks and Spencer's. So what faced with that did we need to do? What was the case against the vocational education regime that we had in this labour market? Well, I think the problem was that it didn't respond in any way to what was actually happening in the labour market, and it didn't equip young people for it. And essentially what was going on was that we were diverting resources with huge inefficiencies, actively encouraging schools and colleges to steer students into easy-to-pass awards, actively discouraging schools and colleges from getting 16 to 18-year-olds who didn't have their maths and English GCSE from doing it, because they might fail and then you wouldn't get paid and you'd end up basically as a broke institution. We basically oriented 16 to 18 vocational education towards government and government contracts, not what the labour market was doing, and there was no clear line of sight to work. And so what I tried to do in the Wolf report was to suggest, and fortunately with some success, that one completely rethink the way 16 to 18 education was oriented, that you fund it the same way as you do everything else, whether it's pre-16 or university education on a per-student basis, that you insist that at least one of the things that people do be really substantive, that there's maths and English, and that there's hard work experience for those who are in vocational programs. And work experience is hard to organise, but it can be done. It can demonstrably be done, and my feeling is that if you can do it really successfully in the Wirral, and you can do it really successfully in Hull, you can do it. And you can, so you can. So that was the bit that I did. But the other bit which I was not able to talk about in my review, because apprenticeship goes DFE and BIS, and the realities of work in government is that if one department asks you to do something, you can't talk about something that's run by another department. So I didn't say very much about apprenticeship, but I sort of flagged it. And to my delight, both the two main departments then, in fact, commissioned an additional review of apprenticeship and committed themselves to apprenticeship reform. Because the thing that had happened was, as I said, that most young people were in full-time education, partly because of the development of the disappearance of the youth labour market, but partly also because of the disappearance of anything that looked like a proper apprenticeship. And until the late 1970s, and I really want to repeat this, we had a functioning apprenticeship system. It might not have been as good as the German as that in general education. It might have been less regulated, less recognised, but we had a functioning apprenticeship system of a completely standard sort, which was the largest destination of school leavers. And a number of things happened. People give different reasons. One thing was apprenticeship pay became very high. Another was we had the recession and the major recessions, industrial failures of the 1980s. But what also happened was the government took against it. Basically, the Thatcher government set out to destroy apprenticeship on the grounds that it was basically a closed shop and inefficient. And successive governments continued this distancing from apprenticeship in favour of what they thought was a more efficient payment by results, qualification-led system. And although it was technically re-embraced by governments in the mid to late 1990s, it wasn't really, because the apprenticeship system that they created was actually one in which it didn't belong to employers, and the quality was systematically undermined by targets, by their funding regime, by payment by results. And those of you who've worked in this area will know that there were a considerable number of scandals which, if it had been anything except apprenticeship and further education and vocational education, would have been on the front pages of the papers, but because it was vocational education, nobody really noticed. So we now have, finally, a reform programme. And as I said, I think it's tremendously important that it succeed. The countries with the best record of youth employment are those with big apprenticeship programmes. But in each case, it's an organically developing programme. It's one that's genuinely employer-led. And we are trying to recreate that, and it will take years, because once you destroy institutions, you can't conjure them back the next day. And the real risk always in a system as centralised and therefore as powerful as ours is that you keep pulling them up by the roots and deciding, oh, I could improve that, and then you stick it back in. And that is not a way to develop a robust system which is accepted and respected by either young people or employers. The two things which I think it's important to understand is that the countries which have got big successful apprenticeship systems are not just having them in manufacturing. They also have declining manufacturing sectors in terms of employment, let alone GDP. And they have expanded into non-traditional fields, and they also have made them demanding. They have a major general education component which recognises that the labour market goes on changing, and that many apprentices will change sector, within months of finishing their apprenticeship, and certainly will as adults, and that general education is what will actually underpin progress. As I said, I think the current apprenticeship reforms are absolutely right in their basic premises. You can always argue about details, but the main point is that they do return it to employers, and they also concentrate on a genuine end of apprenticeship mastery assessment, which is what traditional apprenticeships always did. That's why we have the word masterpiece. And what is really crucial is that future governments hold their nerve, and that the current cross-party consensus holds. That is not our recent tradition. But there are a few things in our favour. We have rejoined the rest of the developed world. We do now recognise that general education beyond 16 might be a good idea. We also have an advantage in that our universities are very flexible. And so is our further education sector. They are quite independent, they are flexible, they are not actually tied to certain routes. One of the big problems, actually, we always hear what's good about Germany, one of the big problems in Germany is a very rigid qualification structure, which basically means if you don't have the right qualification, you can't go on to the next step, however good you are. I think we have temporarily got over numerical targets and payments by results in education. And the other thing which I think we perhaps underestimate is that we actually have, and not just about among those who are going to get 3 A's at A-level, we actually have a highly wired, highly motivated and highly informed population of young people. Now, I know there are pockets where that's not true, but it's pockets. And what is actually impressive when you look at most 16 to 18-year-olds is how much they think about their future, how much they try to find out what is available. And I actually think that this is a real revolution, because it means you can actually get information out to 16 to 18-year-olds without having to depend on teachers to do it all. And the other thing I would like to say is, again, one always hears a lot about the 5% of parents who neglect their children. I'm not even sure that they consciously neglect their children. When you ask people who've just had a baby what they want for their child, they are all ambitious. They are all aware that university is important in modern society. They all want the best. They are all determined to do the best for their child. So I actually think that in that sense, the population is catching up with the realities of today's labour market, and I just hope that the politicians continue to recognise that they can't wave a wand and magic away the bits of it that they would rather not have. Thank you.